The checkpoint incident. It was a quiet evening, the sort where everything felt like it was moving in slow motion. The night air was cool but not cold, and the setting sun had painted the sky with shades of orange and purple, casting long shadows over the winding road. Officer Lydia Harper leaned against her patrol car, her flashlight resting loosely in her hand, scanning the horizon. It was another uneventful night on the outskirts of town, and she was ready to call it a day. The cars passed by, all moving at a steady pace, their headlights cutting through the growing darkness. The checkpoint was set up at the intersection of two roads, a place where cars typically slowed down before continuing on their way. There was little traffic, especially this late in the evening. For the officers stationed here, it was a job that didn't demand too much attention. A routine job. In fact, Lydia was almost too familiar with the monotony of it all. She had been doing this for years, and the stillness of the night usually lulled her into a state of comfort. Most of the time, it was just a matter of checking licenses, asking a few questions, and letting people pass. It wasn't glamorous, but it was safe, predictable, uncomplicated. But then the car appeared. It wasn't much to look at, this beat-up sedan creeping slowly toward her. The vehicle's exhaust rattled and sputtered, and the paint was chipped in places, as though the car had seen better days. Lydia straightened up as she noticed the car's approach. The driver, a man she could see was black, appeared somewhat disheveled, and the vehicle itself seemed worn down. It wasn't a new car, nor did it give the impression that it was well maintained. Still, it wasn't unusual for people to drive vehicles in various states of repair. Yet, something about the vehicle's dilapidated condition made Lydia's eyes narrow. She hadn't seen many cars like that in her line of duty, especially not at this hour. The man's face remained neutral as the car rolled up to the checkpoint. He looked tired, perhaps a little too tired, but his eyes remained focused. Lydia's gaze shifted to his clothes, simple black t-shirt, dark blue jeans. Nothing about him seemed out of the ordinary at first glance, but her suspicion rose. Was he hiding something? Was he trying to avoid detection, hoping to slip through unnoticed? The car stopped just in front of her. Lydia walked forward, her boots clicking sharply against the pavement. She stood tall, squared her shoulders, and approached the car with purpose, tapping her flashlight lightly against the hood of the vehicle. Her eyes studied the driver closely, her face expressionless but calculating. "Roll down the window," she commanded. Her voice was firm, a tone that left little room for debate. The man complied without hesitation. Lydia couldn't see much of his face yet, as the window was slightly lowered, but she could see his eyes. Dark, unreadable. He didn't look panicked. He didn't seem nervous. He was calm, almost too calm for someone who had just been stopped at a checkpoint. There was something in the air, something about the way he carried himself, that made her uneasy. It wasn't his demeanor so much as it was her own gut feeling. Maybe it was because he was alone. Maybe it was because he had driven so slowly. Maybe it was just the way the night felt. She forced her thoughts away and focused on the task at hand. This was a simple traffic stop. Nothing more, nothing less. "What's your business in this area?" she asked, her tone hard but polite. She could feel the coolness of the evening air on her face, but her focus remained on the man in the car. There was no reason for alarm. Not yet. The man's voice was calm, measured. "Just passing through." "It's been a long day, officer." Lydia's eyebrows furrowed as she listened to his response. Nothing about it sounded off, but she wasn't convinced. The routine questions she had asked him seemed to go unanswered, and that little prickling feeling in the back of her mind only grew stronger. She had been in enough situations to know that something just didn't feel right. Perhaps it was just the exhaustion of a long shift, or perhaps it was the man himself. There was something about his voice, so level, so unruffled, that made her think he wasn't just some random driver passing through. Without responding, she motioned to the officers behind her to stop the cars that had been trailing him. It was a simple precaution, just an attempt to keep the situation controlled. But what followed was a shift in the power dynamic. She suddenly found herself assuming the role of the enforcer, deciding who was worthy of respect and who deserved the harshness of authority. "Step out of the car, now," she ordered loudly. The command was clear, but her words carried an unspoken edge. There was a trace of impatience in her tone now, an authority that didn't feel entirely justified. There was something in her voice, an aggressive undertone, that would have set off alarms in a more aware person. But the man, this stranger in front of her, was calm. Too calm. He didn't argue. He simply opened the door and stepped out, his movements deliberate, controlled. Lydia's pulse quickened, not out of fear, but because she knew something had just shifted. She stood her ground, but there was a part of her that felt uneasy. The way he moved, how his hands rested lightly at his sides. It was too perfect, too composed. Something was off, and it gnawed at her from within. Hands on the hood, she snapped. She needed control. She needed authority in the moment. She couldn't allow herself to feel vulnerable, not with this man standing before her. The man complied, though he didn't seem shaken by the command. He placed his hands on the car, his posture stiff but not defiant. Lydia, on the other hand, had a growing sense of discomfort. She began her pat-down, not with the meticulous precision of an experienced officer, but with the forceful, almost reckless energy of someone who was trying to prove a point. As her hands moved over him, she could feel the muscles in his body, the shape of his frame. There was nothing out of the ordinary, but something about the entire encounter felt wrong. The fact that he had complied without protest, the way he kept his calm, there was something unnerving about it. Why wasn't he afraid? Why didn't he challenge her? It was as if the man knew that whatever was happening at this checkpoint was already a farce, already beneath him. His eyes remained locked on the horizon, not giving her the satisfaction of his gaze. Then, without warning, she spat on the ground near his feet. Lydia didn't even realize what she had done until after it was too late. It wasn't a moment of rage. It was more like an involuntary act, something fueled by frustration and disdain. The spit landed near the man's shoes, a symbol of her contempt for him. The word "you people" slipped out of her mouth before she even had a chance to stop it. And the venom was unmistakable. "You people think you can just walk around wherever you want, don't you?" Her voice was sharp, dripping with the kind of disrespect she would never have allowed herself to display in another situation. Jamal's face, as calm as ever, didn't change. His hands were still on the hood, his body still, his breath steady. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He just remained silent, absorbing the words, absorbing the sting. But inside, something shifted. A quiet anger simmered beneath the surface. What would any person do in that moment? Would they stand their ground? Or would they retaliate? Would they lash out in anger? Or would they, like Jamal, keep their dignity intact despite the humiliation? And then the tipping point came. The other officers began to whisper among themselves, and one of them, the same officer who had recognized Jamal moments before, quickly approached Harper. His eyes were wide, his face drained of color. He whispered urgently in her ear. Harper, still standing in front of Jamal, had no idea who this man was. Not yet. But as she listened to the officer's words, a cold realization began to seep into her bones. The man she had just treated with such disregard, the man she had spat on and humiliated, wasn't just anyone. He was Jamal Lawson, the newly appointed chief sheriff of the entire town. In that moment, the weight of her actions crashed down on her. She felt her heart race, her breath quicken. Her body, once full of authority, now felt like lead. She stared at Jamal, her mouth dry, the apology already on her lips. But it was too late. The revelation. As the officer whispered into Lydia Harper's ear, her stomach sank, and a cold chill ran through her veins. She barely heard the words, but the meaning was clear enough. The man she had just treated like a criminal, the one she had humiliated and disrespected, was none other than Jamal Lawson, the newly appointed chief sheriff of the town. Harper's heart skipped a beat. Her mind, racing to process the revelation, felt like it had short-circuited. She blinked hard, trying to make sense of what was happening. She turned to face Jamal, her mouth moving, but no words escaping. It was as though time itself had slowed. The man she had just spat near, the man she had so hastily assumed was beneath her, now stood before her as a powerful figure. Someone who held authority that could dismantle her career in an instant. Jamal's eyes met hers, cold and unflinching. His expression was calm, almost detached, as though he had been expecting this moment. He didn't look angry or vengeful, though Lydia could feel the weight of his quiet authority pressing down on her. It was not rage that filled the air, but something far more dangerous: disappointment. The officers nearby stood in stunned silence. There was no applause or open censure from them, but Lydia could feel their eyes on her. They were all watching, waiting for her to react, for her to handle the situation with grace and professionalism. Instead, Lydia could only stand there, frozen, utterly aware of her folly. She had just committed an unforgivable breach of judgment, one that could ruin her career and, more importantly, one that could have severe consequences for her future in law enforcement. The officer who had recognized Jamal seemed to shrink in his own discomfort as he looked back and forth between his superior and the man she had just abused. There was no way to reverse the damage. There was no way to sweep it under the rug. What had just happened at the checkpoint had unfolded beyond anyone's control. The moment of confrontation had passed, but the repercussions would linger far longer. Jamal's voice, smooth but heavy with gravity, broke the oppressive silence. "You should be more careful with your actions, Officer Harper," he said, his tone calm but unmistakably firm. "You never know who you might be dealing with." His words weren't loud, but they carried a weight that seemed to reverberate in the cool evening air. It wasn't the tone of a reprimand, but rather a reminder, one that, for all her training, Lydia had overlooked. She had assumed power over someone she thought she could control, only to learn that her assumptions had been gravely misguided. And worse still, she had made a momentary judgment based solely on prejudice. Her eyes shifted to the ground, unable to meet his gaze. She could feel her breath coming faster now, her pulse racing. She wanted to apologize, to explain herself, but there was no justification for her actions. No excuse that could erase what had just transpired. Jamal stood tall and unwavering. "I'll see you at the precinct tomorrow," he said, his voice low and final. He didn't wait for her response, nor did he need to. The matter had already been decided in his mind. There was no going back now. Harper's lips parted as though she were about to speak, to apologize or protest, but no words came out. The realization of what she had done sank in deeper, like a lead weight pulling her down. She felt hollow, as though everything she had worked for had just crumbled in the span of a few moments. The abuse of power, the unjust treatment, the prejudice she had displayed, all of it hung over her like a dark cloud. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a moral and professional failure. As Jamal walked away from the checkpoint, his back straight and his steps confident, Harper remained rooted to the spot. She watched him go, a sinking feeling in her chest. There was nothing more to say or do now, not in this moment. The reality of the situation hit her like a truck. She had just treated the wrong person in the wrong way. And now she would have to face the consequences. The town would soon know what had happened, and Lydia Harper knew that her life, her career, would never be the same again. The power dynamics had shifted. Jamal, the man she had belittled, was now the one in charge, and his influence in the coming days would be far-reaching. She couldn't undo her actions, and no apology would be enough to change what had already been done. The following morning, the precinct was alive with murmurs. The usual bustle of police officers going about their morning duties was interrupted by the whispered rumors about what had occurred the night before. Officers who had worked with Harper for years, officers who had known her as an effective and reliable colleague, were now questioning the woman they had once respected. The air was thick with tension, and Lydia could feel it as soon as she stepped through the doors. She was called into Jamal's office, her heart pounding in her chest as she made her way down the sterile hallway. The hum of fluorescent lights above her seemed too loud now, as though every step she took was echoing in her ears. She couldn't escape the sinking feeling of shame, nor could she shake the realization that her actions had been witnessed by the very people she worked with. She had shown herself to be weak, vindictive, and careless. The road ahead seemed like an unscalable mountain. When she entered Jamal's office, the silence was deafening. He was sitting behind his desk, his eyes scanning a folder in front of him. Seemingly unaffected by her presence, he looked up when she entered, his gaze cool and unreadable. There was no anger in his eyes, but there was something far more telling: disappointment. "Officer Harper," Jamal began, his voice firm but not loud. "We need to talk about last night." Harper stood there, her back straight and her hands clenched at her sides. She knew this conversation would be one she would remember for the rest of her life. She had heard about disciplinary actions, about internal investigations, but this felt different. This was about something deeper, something that wasn't going to be swept under the rug, not this time. Jamal's expression was impassive as he continued. "What you did at the checkpoint last night wasn't just a violation of protocol. It was a violation of trust. Your actions were driven by prejudice, and that's something we cannot and will not tolerate in this department." Lydia swallowed hard, her throat dry. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but there was nothing to say. There was no excuse for what she had done. She had crossed a line, and now the consequences would come for her. The words felt hollow as they left her lips. I'm sorry." Jamal shook his head slowly, his expression hardening. "An apology doesn't undo the damage, Officer Harper. You need to understand that the way you treated Jamal Lawson last night was unacceptable. It was not only unprofessional but deeply harmful. As a law enforcement officer, you're supposed to protect and serve, not demean and judge based on appearances. What you did was a clear abuse of your power." Harper felt the weight of his words sink into her soul. She had no response. How could she justify her actions when even she knew they were indefensible? She had acted on impulse, driven by a bias that had clouded her judgment. And now she was standing at the precipice of the consequences. "I filed a formal complaint against you, Officer Harper," Jamal continued, his voice firm. "This investigation will be thorough, and we will make sure that everyone in this department is held accountable for their actions. I don't care how long it takes, but we will find a way to rebuild the trust that you've broken." Lydia's stomach churned. She had seen officers fired for less. She had seen careers ruined over much smaller missteps. And now she feared that hers would be no different. Jamal paused, his gaze never leaving hers. "You've damaged the reputation of this department, Officer Harper. You've shown the community exactly what happens when authority is misused. It's not just about you anymore. It's about everyone who wears this badge." The weight of those words pressed down on her like a heavy stone. She had failed. There was no denying it. She had been so caught up in her own preconceived notions that she had ignored the very principles she had sworn to uphold. "I'll be reporting this to the town council, and the community will be aware of what happened," Jamal said coldly, the finality in his tone unmistakable. "And as for you, Officer Harper, I will leave it up to the investigation to determine your future here. But understand this: there will be consequences. There always are." With that, he dismissed her, and Lydia turned to leave his office, her legs feeling like lead. She didn't know what would come next, whether she would keep her job or be dismissed. All she knew was that her actions had consequences, and now she would have to live with them. The world she had once known was slipping away, and all because of one moment where she had allowed her biases to take control. The aftermath. Lydia Harper walked out of Jamal's office, her legs feeling as though they were encased in concrete. Each step she took seemed to echo louder than the last, and she could feel the weight of the eyes upon her. The officers who had been in the precinct that morning knew what had happened, and their gaze was unmistakably cold, some filled with disappointment, others with disdain. It was as though the respect she had once commanded had evaporated into thin air, leaving behind only the bitter remnants of her mistakes. As she moved through the precinct, Lydia felt a profound sense of isolation. Her colleagues, who had once greeted her with friendly nods and casual conversations, now avoided her gaze. The usual camaraderie was gone, replaced with an uncomfortable silence. She could sense the walls closing in around her, the judgment from those who once considered her one of their own now seeping through the cracks in her carefully constructed professional facade. The door to her office felt heavier than usual as she stepped inside. She closed it softly behind her, leaning against it for a moment. There was no longer any joy in the space. The walls that once bore mementos of her service, small awards and photos of family, now felt oppressive. Every inch of the room seemed to remind her of everything she had lost in the span of a single decision. Her mind flashed back to the night before, to Jamal's calm yet piercing stare as she humiliated him in front of her colleagues. Her hands clenched involuntarily as the guilt continued to gnaw at her. She sank into the chair behind her desk, her eyes briefly closing as she tried to gather her thoughts. What had gone wrong? How had she allowed herself to cross that line? The more she thought about it, the more she realized just how deeply her actions were rooted in assumptions and biases. Biases that, if she were being honest with herself, she had harbored for years. The fear of the unknown, the judgment of someone who didn't fit the mold of what she expected in a person of authority. Those things had clouded her judgment. She had treated Jamal as less than human, as a stereotype, and now the truth of it all was sinking in. She could never take it back. Her phone buzzed on the desk, dragging her back into the present moment. It was an email from her supervisor, requesting an immediate meeting with her later in the afternoon. The dread that filled her chest at the thought of it was overwhelming. She knew what that meeting would be about. She knew that this would only be the beginning of a much larger fallout. Lydia stared at the screen for a long moment, her finger hovering over the reply button. She had always prided herself on being a competent officer, someone who could be counted on to make decisions based on fairness and integrity. But now it felt like everything she had worked for was slipping away. What would the town think when the story broke? The incident at the checkpoint would undoubtedly become a topic of conversation. Social media would explode with opinions, and the local news would undoubtedly report on it. In a small town like this, where everyone knew everyone, her actions would be dissected and discussed by people she had known for years. Her family, her friends, even the people she had once considered her allies. How would they view her now? Would they believe in the woman she had tried so hard to be, or would they only see the officer who had abused her power in a moment of weakness? As the day dragged on, Lydia could barely concentrate on anything. The hum of her computer, the voices of her colleagues in the hallway, the sound of sirens in the distance, everything felt muted, as though she were living in a dream that she couldn't wake up from. The hours seemed to stretch on endlessly. When her shift finally ended, it felt like a small reprieve, though it did little to alleviate the storm brewing inside her. The public outcry. Meanwhile, the town was starting to buzz with rumors. As the incident at the checkpoint began to circulate, whispers turned into conversations. People were talking about it in the local coffee shops, at the grocery store, and on social media. As soon as the word got out that Jamal Lawson had been treated poorly by an officer, the town's attention shifted to what had occurred. The initial reaction from the community was divided. Some were appalled at what had happened, calling out the clear abuse of power and the prejudice that had fueled the interaction. They demanded answers, calling for action to be taken against Officer Harper. How could someone in law enforcement, someone who was supposed to protect and serve, behave in such a manner? Others, however, expressed doubt. They were reluctant to jump to conclusions, instead offering rationalizations for what had transpired. Maybe Harper had been having a bad day. Maybe there was something more to the story. Some even speculated that Jamal, being a newcomer to town, might have acted suspiciously in some way that warranted such treatment. But as more people came forward, the narrative began to shift. It wasn't just about one officer's behavior. It was about a system that had allowed prejudice to fester and manifest in ways that were often overlooked or ignored. The town council met quickly in response to the growing public outcry. The situation was becoming a political issue now, with demands from the public to ensure accountability. The town's leaders were put in the difficult position of responding to the community's concerns while protecting the integrity of the department. Calls for Lydia Harper's resignation were loud and unrelenting, and the pressure mounted. But it wasn't just the council that felt the heat. Jamal, as the new chief sheriff, found himself in a difficult position as well. On one hand, he had to address the misconduct of one of his officers and uphold the values of justice and fairness. On the other hand, he had to do so in a way that didn't undermine the trust of the community in the police force he had just assumed command of. Jamal had spent the morning meeting with community leaders, listening to their concerns and acknowledging the damage that had been done. It was clear to him that the community was deeply divided on this issue. Some people were angry, some were confused, and some were even questioning his authority after the incident had come to light. He couldn't let this slip by. He needed to ensure that the department was held accountable, and he needed to show the town that he would lead with integrity. The internal investigation. Later that afternoon, Lydia walked into the meeting with her supervisor, her nerves raw and her thoughts a whirlwind of self-doubt. The walls of the meeting room felt like they were closing in around her as she sat across from the department's senior leadership. The air was thick with unspoken words, the tension palpable. Her supervisor, Officer Blake Peterson, looked at her with a stern but not unkind expression. He was a man who had seen his fair share of internal investigations, and Lydia knew he wasn't one to mince words. He began by laying out the facts of the situation, reminding her of the chain of events from the checkpoint incident. The entire department had witnessed her actions, and the town was now demanding accountability. Blake made it clear that the matter was far from resolved, and the investigation would be thorough. "What were you thinking, Harper?" Blake asked, his voice calm but filled with disbelief. "You've been on this job long enough to know how important it is to maintain control in situations like that. But last night, you crossed a line." Lydia could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. There was no excuse for what she had done, no justification that could make it right. She had abused her power in the worst possible way, and now the consequences were cascading toward her with the inevitability of a tidal wave. I don't know what happened," Lydia stammered, her voice weak. "I was wrong. I know that. But it wasn't intentional. I don't know why I let it get so far. It's not who I am." Blake nodded, but his expression remained hard. "Intent doesn't matter right now. What matters is how your actions were perceived, and how they've affected the community. We've seen this before, Lydia. We've seen how small instances like this can snowball into something much bigger. And it's not just about you. It's about this department, about the public trust, and about the safety of the people we serve." Lydia nodded silently, her eyes focused on the table in front of her. The weight of her failure pressed down on her chest. She knew that whatever happened next, she couldn't undo the damage that had been done. Blake continued, "There's going to be a formal internal investigation. The public's calling for action, and you're under scrutiny. Your actions have shaken this department, and if we're going to move forward, there needs to be accountability. We'll be discussing this with the town council, and I'm sure the media will have their say as well." The next few days would be critical. The investigation would unfold, and Lydia's fate would be determined by how well she could justify her actions, if at all. Would the department stand by her, or would the weight of public opinion force them to take swift action? One thing was certain: Lydia Harper's future in law enforcement was hanging by a thread, and the road ahead would require her to confront her own biases, her own failures, and the stark reality of what had just happened. The investigation and growing tensions. The days following the incident at the checkpoint felt like an eternity for Lydia Harper. The reality of her actions hung over her like a cloud, casting a shadow on everything she did. The investigation was underway, and every hour seemed to stretch out in unbearable anticipation. She had no idea how things would unfold, but the pressure was mounting, and she could feel the weight of it crushing her. Every step she took around the precinct, every glance exchanged with her colleagues, every whisper behind her back, it all made it clear that she was no longer welcome in the very place she had once called home. Inside the precinct, things were tense. Officers who had previously respected her were now questioning her integrity. Some spoke in hushed tones, others looked away when she walked into the room. It was as if the air itself was charged with uncertainty. There were rumors circulating, some claiming that the department would take severe disciplinary action, while others speculated that the pressure from the public would force a resignation. Some officers, still loyal to her, defended her actions, arguing that people made mistakes, while others felt deeply uncomfortable, believing that what happened at the checkpoint could not simply be swept under the rug. Lydia tried to carry on with her duties, but it was nearly impossible. The knowledge that her every move was under scrutiny paralyzed her, making her unable to focus. Her once proud and confident demeanor had evaporated, replaced by a woman who was now battling her own shame and self-loathing. What had started as a routine shift had spiraled into a nightmare, and there was no escaping it. The public's demands. Outside the walls of the precinct, the town was divided. The town square was filled with the usual bustle, but there was an underlying current of tension in the air. Local businesses had begun to display signs that read "Justice for Jamal" or "Hold Officer Harper accountable." Social media was flooded with posts, some of which were demanding a complete investigation into the town's police force, and others expressing anger at the way Jamal had been treated. For the first time in years, the community was united on one issue: the way one officer had abused her power. The hashtag Justice for Jamal trended across local social media platforms, and the story found its way onto news outlets. People from all backgrounds expressed their outrage, not just at Harper's actions, but at the systemic issues that allowed such behavior to go unchecked for so long. Activists called for reforms to the police department, pushing for anti-bias training and a deeper look into how officers were trained to interact with marginalized communities. For Jamal, the outcry was expected but still painful. He had been treated unjustly by Officer Harper, and while he understood that this wasn't a reflection of every officer, it was a stark reminder of the prejudice that still permeated many law enforcement agencies. What pained him even more was the realization that this was just one incident of many. He couldn't help but wonder how many others had been subjected to similar treatment. His sense of duty to the community deepened. He had to ensure that this wasn't an isolated case, that the department as a whole was held accountable for creating an environment where such behavior could flourish. Jamal's decision to publicly address the situation became inevitable. A press conference was scheduled, and he took to the podium with the weight of the town's expectations on his shoulders. The media buzzed around him, microphones thrust into his face as cameras flashed. He had already received backlash from some who argued that he was too quick to speak out, while others applauded his courage. "We cannot ignore the reality that exists in this town," Jamal began, his voice steady but filled with purpose. "As law enforcement officers, we are entrusted with a responsibility to protect and serve every member of our community, regardless of their race, gender, or background. What happened at the checkpoint was a clear violation of that trust." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the gathered crowd, then continued. "The actions of Officer Harper were inexcusable, and they have set us back in our efforts to build trust within the community. But this isn't just about one officer. This is about a system that has allowed bias and prejudice to persist in ways that many of us haven't recognized. We must confront this head-on and work to eliminate any form of discrimination within our department." The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. Jamal's speech struck a chord, and the media outlets seized upon his words. He was clear and resolute in his stance, but it was not just about holding Harper accountable. It was about creating real, lasting change in the department. His leadership would be defined by this moment, whether he liked it or not. The department's response. Back at the precinct, the fallout from the press conference was immediate. Lydia's fate was now being discussed at every level of the department. There was no escaping the pressure. The investigation into her conduct continued, and the internal review process was thorough and meticulous. The department's Internal Affairs Division launched a full investigation into the incident, interviewing officers who had been present at the checkpoint and reviewing the body cam footage. Lydia was called in for questioning. She was no longer the officer she once was, confident, respected, and in control. Now, sitting in a small room with two internal affairs investigators, she felt like a criminal. Her mind raced as they asked her about the events leading up to the checkpoint stop. What had she seen? What had she heard? Why had she treated Jamal in such a manner? I don't know what came over me," Lydia stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what happened. I've been doing this job for so long, and I've never done anything like that. I don't know why I treated him the way I did." The investigators exchanged a look, and Lydia could feel the weight of their skepticism. They had heard similar excuses before, and they weren't buying it. The question wasn't just about what happened that night. It was about why it had happened. Why had she allowed her prejudices to influence her judgment? Why had she allowed her own biases to dictate how she treated someone who could have been anyone else? As the interview continued, Lydia's frustration grew. She wanted to explain herself, to somehow justify her actions, but no matter how hard she tried, the truth remained clear. She had acted out of judgment, out of prejudice, and there was no denying it. The investigation would likely recommend disciplinary action, and the possibility of her termination was becoming increasingly likely. Back at her desk later that afternoon, Lydia found herself staring at the phone in her hand, scrolling through the messages on social media. The vitriol was hard to ignore, the accusations pouring in from every angle. Even her family, who had stood by her through thick and thin, had begun to question her actions. Her mother had sent a text that simply read, "What happened, Lydia? This isn't the daughter I raised." The words stung, but they were justified. The department was also under immense pressure to take swift action. The internal affairs investigation was ongoing, but the public was demanding results. Protesters gathered outside the police department in the evenings, chanting for accountability. The calls for reform were growing louder, with community leaders urging Jamal to act decisively to restore faith in the department. While Jamal was dealing with the weight of public opinion, the internal issues of the department were equally pressing. The officers who had witnessed the incident were torn between their loyalty to their colleague and the reality of the situation. Some were calling for a swift resolution, arguing that Harper's actions were unforgivable. Others, still loyal to her, sought leniency, believing that the department's handling of the situation would impact future policing. Jamal's leadership. Jamal found himself in the middle of a storm. He had made a clear statement to the public, but the road ahead was anything but clear. He had to ensure that the department underwent real reform, but he also had to navigate the delicate balance of holding his officers accountable while maintaining morale within the force. Jamal knew that this was more than just a matter of one officer's misconduct. It was a question of systemic change. He had inherited a department that had long been criticized for its lack of diversity, for its failure to address issues of racial profiling, and for its failure to build meaningful relationships with the community it served. The incident with Officer Harper was just a symptom of a much larger issue. For Jamal, the solution was not just to discipline one officer, but to implement changes that would prevent future incidents from occurring. This meant revisiting the training protocols for new recruits, ensuring that racial bias training became a core part of the police academy curriculum, and creating opportunities for officers to engage with the community in meaningful ways. It wasn't going to be an easy fix, but Jamal knew that if he wanted to change the culture of the department, he would have to start from within. He gathered his officers for a department-wide meeting, where he addressed them directly. "We are at a crossroads," Jamal began, his voice steady but strong. "What happened at that checkpoint was wrong. It was a failure on many levels, but it's not just about one person's actions. It's about a culture of accountability. It's about ensuring that every one of us treats the people we serve with dignity and respect. And it's about making sure that no officer ever feels above the law. Jamal's words resonated with many in the room, but there were others who felt defensive, unsure of what their place was in this new environment. Would they be scrutinized for every action? Would they be held to impossible standards? The changes Jamal was advocating for would be met with resistance, but he knew they were necessary. He would need to lead with both strength and empathy if he were to succeed in transforming the department. Lydia Harper's future remained uncertain, but Jamal's leadership would determine the future of the department as a whole. The road ahead was rocky, but Jamal was committed to bringing about the reforms that were long overdue. The community's call for reform. The fallout from Lydia Harper's actions continued to reverberate across the town. What had initially seemed like a localized issue, the misconduct of one officer, quickly escalated into a broader debate about policing, race, and power dynamics within law enforcement. The town, once peaceful and divided on only the usual trivialities, was now grappling with an urgent need for change. The anger that bubbled to the surface had brought to light the town's deeper issues with the police department, and as the days passed, it became clear that this wasn't just a matter of one officer's failure. It was a systemic problem that had been allowed to fester for years. The media continued to cover the story extensively. News stations aired debates, interviews, and community responses. People who had lived in the town their whole lives now found themselves divided, unsure of how to view the police department that had once been a symbol of protection and trust. Social media exploded with passionate posts demanding justice, with hashtags such as #JusticeForJamal gaining traction across various platforms. The story of a police officer abusing her power had become a national conversation, one that would not be easily forgotten. In the midst of this growing turmoil, Jamal Lawson was forced to address not only the issue of Officer Harper, but also the broader implications for the entire police force. While he knew his decisions would be scrutinized by the public and the media, Jamal understood the gravity of the moment. It was clear to him that this was an opportunity for the department to begin the difficult process of rebuilding trust, but it would require real, tangible changes. The town hall meeting. A turning point. Jamal knew that words alone would not be enough to heal the rift between the police department and the community. He needed to show that he was committed to bringing about change and making sure that the mistakes of the past weren't repeated. And so, he scheduled a town hall meeting, a public forum where citizens could come together to discuss their grievances, ask questions, and have an open dialogue with law enforcement. It was time for transparency, and Jamal was ready to lead the charge. The town hall was held in the community center, a space that was often used for civic events. The room was packed with citizens of all backgrounds. Some were activists, others were longtime residents who had always supported the police, and some were people who had never before thought to question the role of law enforcement in their lives. Jamal stood at the front of the room, a single microphone in hand, ready to face the community that was now holding him accountable. The air was thick with anticipation, and Jamal could feel the weight of the room's eyes on him. He began by addressing the incident directly. "I'm sure many of you have seen the news," he said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "What happened at that checkpoint was wrong. Officer Harper's actions were inexcusable, and I understand why so many of you are upset. But this goes beyond just one officer's behavior. This is a problem that runs deeper, a problem that we all need to confront. The truth is, our department has not done enough to address issues of bias, racism, and abuse of power. We cannot continue to allow these issues to go unchecked. We need real change." There was a quiet murmur of agreement from the crowd, though many were still skeptical. Jamal could see the doubt in some faces, people who weren't sure if his words were just a political move or if he was truly committed to change. He understood their hesitation. It wasn't just about reforming one officer. It was about overhauling an entire system that had, for too long, allowed prejudiced actions to go unchallenged. "I am committed to ensuring that this department changes," Jamal continued. We will be instituting new training programs focused on racial bias and cultural sensitivity. We will also be implementing greater oversight, making sure that incidents like this never happen again. And most importantly, we will work to rebuild the trust between this department and the community. Trust is something that takes years to build and seconds to destroy. But I believe that, together, we can restore that trust. There was a moment of silence in the room. People were processing his words, considering whether they believed in the sincerity of his commitment. Then, a voice called out from the back of the room. "And what about Harper? What's going to happen to her?" The question was inevitable, and Jamal had been prepared for it. He took a deep breath and met the speaker's gaze. "Officer Harper is currently under investigation, and she will face the consequences of her actions. There will be no special treatment here, but I also want to be clear about something. This isn't just about one officer. It's about creating a system where every officer is held accountable for their actions. No one is above the law." The crowd seemed to soften a little at this, though Jamal knew that the path forward would not be easy. He wasn't naive. He knew that there would be challenges. The department had many supporters, and there were officers who had worked alongside Harper for years, who now found themselves in an uncomfortable position. But Jamal was determined to push forward, regardless of the obstacles. He opened the floor to questions, and the community didn't hold back. People asked tough questions, questioning the department's past actions, the relationship between the police and the community, and how they could trust that Jamal's promises would be more than just words. Jamal listened patiently, answering each question with the same level of seriousness and commitment. He didn't shy away from difficult conversations. He faced them head-on. One elderly woman stood up, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I've lived here my whole life," she said, "and I've seen things happen in this town that I never should have. People in power have gotten away with things for too long. What will you do to ensure that this town doesn't go back to the way it was?" Her words struck a chord with Jamal. He had heard similar stories from other residents, stories of discrimination, injustice, and neglect. It was clear to him that the change needed to go beyond just the police department. It needed to involve the community too. The town had to reckon with its history and address the inequalities that had existed for far too long. "I understand your concerns," Jamal said, his voice full of empathy. "This town's history is complicated, and I know that there's a lot of pain and distrust. But I promise you, we're not going back to the way things were. We are going to move forward together, and that means we have to face these issues head-on. We're not going to ignore the past, but we will work to build a future that is more just, more equitable, and more compassionate for everyone." The meeting lasted for hours, but by the end, Jamal could feel a shift in the room. The crowd was still wary, but they were beginning to believe that perhaps change was possible. The next few weeks would be crucial. He knew that. There would be more town halls, more discussions, more efforts to rebuild the relationship between the police and the community. But this meeting had been a start, and it had been a powerful one. Rebuilding trust, moving forward. As the days passed, the town continued to grapple with the aftermath of the checkpoint incident. The police department was under intense scrutiny, and Jamal worked tirelessly to ensure that the reforms he had promised were put into place. The investigation into Officer Harper's actions moved forward, and the public was demanding results. But Jamal's focus remained on the larger picture, reforming the entire department and ensuring that the culture of policing in their town would change for the better. One of the first steps was the establishment of a community advisory board. This board, made up of local residents from all walks of life, would meet regularly with the police department to discuss concerns, review policies, and ensure that the department was staying on track with its commitments to reform. Jamal understood that the department could not operate in a vacuum. It needed input from the people it served. Training programs focused on de-escalation tactics, cultural sensitivity, and implicit bias were rolled out for all officers. Jamal knew that real change required long-term investment in the people who wore the badge. The department couldn't just promise change. It had to make sure that its officers were equipped with the tools and knowledge to live up to those promises every day. But even as these changes began to take root, the town continued to watch, waiting to see whether Jamal's vision would be realized. There were those who believed in his leadership, who trusted that he would steer the department in the right direction. And then there were those who remained skeptical, still wondering whether the status quo would return once the dust settled. For Jamal, the road ahead was still long and fraught with challenges. But he was undeterred. He knew that this was the opportunity to build something new, something stronger, more compassionate, and more accountable. And he was willing to fight for that future, no matter what it took. As for Lydia Harper, her future remained uncertain. The investigation into her conduct continued, but Jamal had made it clear that the department would not tolerate any further abuses of power. Harper would face the consequences of her actions, but Jamal's commitment to reform meant that she was just one part of a much larger conversation. This wasn't just about one officer. It was about ensuring that the department, as a whole, moved forward in a way that was just and fair for all. The process of healing and rebuilding trust would take time, but Jamal was ready to lead his town through it, step by step, no matter how difficult the journey.